There are years when nothing happens, and then there are days when years happen. Chronos, Kairos, and Zeitbewusstsein, a brief history of time. Welcome everyone to the Intrusible Chamber. The statement, there are years when nothing happens, and then there are days when years happen, is often attributed to Vladimir Lenin, speaking of the Russian Revolution. Perhaps it was a reference to John Reed's 10 Days That Shook the World. Unfortunately, the provenance of this statement is incredibly dubious. It may have actually become associated with Lenin only after the fall of the Soviet Union, ironically. But regardless of the veracity over whatever Lenin said it aside, as a statement, it epitomizes a paradox that historians face. There are years when nothing happens, indicates a passage of time which is merely indicated, Chronos, versus days when years happen, Kairos, time of action, the time of historical events, or even in a theological and even philosophical sense, a time which is due, while the whole statement indicates a Zeitbewusstsein, a subjective awareness of the qualitative value of time, even an awareness of existing in the spirit of a time, a zeitgeist, and a new revolutionary time, modernity. This really, you can say, undergirds so much of the paradoxes of historical analysis, which so few historians will ever face, but I'm prepared to delve deep into all of these conceptual arguments this evening. Indeed, this is one of the many streams where the English language has completely failed me. So I'm going to be delving into Greek concepts, I'm going to be delving into French concepts, and I'm going to be delving into German concepts because the English language has not afforded me the means for which to express these terms. But in many ways, this talking about the nature of historical time and trying to also have its own chronology presented as a bit of a history of how we interpret time is a spiritual successor for when I talked about Kant, in particular the value of the critique of pure reason to an epistemology of history or theory of historical knowledge, because in there I was discussing the fact that he was looking at the supersensible substrata, the idea that there is an element undergirding the natural sciences, which is the continuation and fixed nature of the passage of time, which means that we have a basis from which to ground our concepts without falling into pits of, nihilism and absolute skepticism. Time is a continuum. And from this continuum, we can't have any spatial conception of what time is. We only have time through indication, and we catalog and create systems of indication, minutes, hours, days, etc. And this is what Chronos is taken to mean, chronology, in that it signifies scientific time, time which is constant. Indeed, it's interesting that this actually comes out of the Greek idea of chronos, father time, and there being a personalized element to chronos. But in terms of how we've now received it, in terms of distinguishing these various ideas of historical time, chronos is actually the most depersonalized out of all of them. Indeed, Marc Bloch, who was writing about this topic, he was one of the most famous French historians of the 20th century, said that real time is in essence a continuum, again echoing that statement from Kant, but it is also perpetual change. The great problems of historical inquiry derive from the antithesis of these two attributes, namely the idea that there is transience and permanence coexisting side by side. I think the funny thing is that I read that and I almost look at it as somewhat complete nonsense. It's not an antithesis. I would say it is historical inquiry. Historical inquiry is dealing with this absurdity. It's dealing with the absurdity that we don't have permanence. Everything is change. Everything is predicated on time. And what makes it even more, you can say, absurd is that I am going to be taking the concept of time, historical time, placing it against a concept of scientific time, and trying to deconstruct it as much as it is humanly possible to do so, because it's not just that time is in essence a continuum. That's a scientific concept, but historical time does not necessarily interpret it as a continuum. So it's a perpetual change, and it's a change about how we interpret that continuum, that constancy. Everything is this degree of subjective and intersubjective, which undergirds everything, not just our relationship to one another, but our relationship to our position within time. This whole idea of the spatial elusiveness of time and this perpetual transience. I was also thinking of other words to sort of signify many of the things which I'm trying to get across here. One of the other terms I was thinking of using in lieu of this very obscure German word, Zeitbewusstsein, was Durée. Unfortunately, I couldn't use that word for reasons that will become obvious, because there are two very specific meanings of durée. From, obviously, in English, we have the equivalent duration in time. There is the longue durée, which exists in historiography, which was pioneered by Fernand Braudel, Marc Bloch's great collaborator, where there is the history which is not determined by events, the history which is determined by the currents of the natural environment of the Mediterranean Ocean, etc., etc. There are hundreds of years where, again, to echo that statement, again, ostensibly from Lenin, these are the years when nothing happens, and these are the years, essentially, which the longue durée is focused on. But even that, again, would, as I'm going to say, be an oversimplification. It's not fair to say that the long duration is Chronos, and this idea of the event in history is Kairos. No, it's even more confusing and convoluted than that. Instead, the concept of durée, which I think is actually more applicable to this stream, is a concept which was devised by Henri Bergson. You can say actually the whole idea of durée was, from the point of view of French historiography, inherited by Bergson. But Bergson really investigates this idea of there being quantitative time, Chronos, versus the idea of qualitative time, Kairos, that there is, we as human beings have a relationship to time, and our subjective value placed on instances in time is far more relevant than looking at the scientific conception of time, which is that of fixed continuum. When Bergson, and indeed he was a great Catholic analytic philosopher, was dealing with this at the turn of the 20th century, he was considering this idea of duration, as a rhythm of a time consciousness. And indeed, given what essentially I'm going to be trying to arrive at the end of this conversation, which is how do these concepts of Kairos, Chronos, allow us to establish things and concepts such as modernity and spirit of the times, this whole notion of a rhythm undergirding our own subjective experience throughout all of time is very important. He wrote, Bergson, Time and Free Will, an essay on the immediate data of consciousness. And the interesting thing about that, again, is that it seemed to be echoing many of the statements that were brought up by Immanuel Kant, which I've already referred to on another stream, hence why I look at this stream as a spiritual successor in many ways. But in particular, Henri Bergson wrote this on time in Creative Evolution. I'll try and unpack it to the best of my ability. The truth is, we change without ceasing. The whole idea that history and time is that of perpetual, unceasing change. There is no essential difference between passing from one state to another and persisting in the same state. So, almost again, a contradiction that there is a constancy in the transition. And so, in many ways, we are progressing from one state to another, yet we are also remaining more or less the same. If the state which remains the same is more varied than we think, then on the other hand, the passing of one state to another resembles more than we imagine a single state prolonged. The transition is continuous. Again, do we think of these moments simply ceasing and ending, or do we think of this as a long period of transition, almost where it seems that these changes are not evident? Just because we close our eyes to the unceasing variation of every physical state, we are obliged, when change has become so formidable as to force itself on our attention, to speak if a new state were placed alongside the previous one. This, you can say, is the indication of Kairos, the event in history, the Russian Revolution, which has imposed itself on our conception of time, which seems again so, from the point of view of Bergson, to use his word, formidable. You can almost say so all-encompassing in terms of shattering our conceptions of this state of being, which is prolonged, the idea of transition, that this whole notion of transition is thrown out, and instead we have the whole identity of revolution. Nevertheless, Bergson then goes on to say, of this new state, we assume that it remains unvarying in its turn, and so on endlessly. He's almost looking at this as epochal. So much of history is divided into sections: antiquity, Middle Ages, early modern, modernity. Where one period ostensibly ends, it effectively ceases to be. There is no connection with what previously existed, and we enter a new phase, a new reality. What he's really indicating there is that in part that forms a subjective experience. We believe ourselves to be existing in modernity, and that prospect of modernity is so all-encompassing and so formidable that we essentially see it as potentially endless. It is a result of time. It perhaps exists throughout all of time, to the point that when you have one of these other revolutionary events, one of these events of the 10 days that shook the world, everything breaks down and the whole sequence repeats again. So again, just in that one statement, we look at time, we look at our conscious relationship with time, which is what Bergson is very much focusing on. And we look at the historical event, which again, I'm going to be using as Kairos, arriving at the Neue Zeit, modernity, the new age we are confronted with. Undergirding this again is another core element to this discussion, which is the arrival of modernity. Our conception of time is underpinned by two revolutions, the Industrial Revolution and the French Revolution. One where our whole notion of time and concepts was actually accelerated because of the reduction of spaces caused by transportation, the invention of the railroad, etc. And in the French Revolution, by the rationalizing impulse towards creating a new equality for man, the new calendar, etc., the anticipation of utopia. All of these things place an expectation that time itself is speeding up. You can look at all of this and say, well, this is all subjective. You know, historically, the days and the minutes are still counting down in this chronological order, but nevertheless, our whole conception, history's perception of these events is speeding up. That's what I talk about when I talk about revolutionism and time. And that's why you can say the core component of this idea of a brief history of time, you can say in many ways, you can take it as a tragic instance of the brief history of time, is that we go from the more or less sort of primordial state where few events happen, which are of great sort of alteration or disturbance. And then we have a period in time in which progress seems so all-encompassing as to be irresistible. However, when I use these terms, there is such a rich history of the etymology of these terms and the usage, in particular in Kairos. I'm familiar that most of you will have some familiarity with Chronos, if nothing other than just being able to derive terms, chronology, chronometry, chronometer. But with Kairos, this might be the first time many of you have actually even heard of that concept. I'm going to be citing many articles for this evening, but one of these articles is by Joanne, and he has a very succinct summary in the use of Kairos in Renaissance political philosophy. As usual, all the articles I have for this evening will be cited in the description. The word Kairos has its roots in archery, where it denoted a penetrable opening, an aperture, through which Greek archers aimed, simulating the forest of shields and armor through which an arrow must pass to reach its target. This origin explains the many meanings of Kairos, such as mark and target, both literally, as in the Iliad, where it indicates a place in the body to strike fatally, and figuratively, such as in Sophocles' Electra, in which Orestes urges, "Listen closely to my words and correct me if I miss the mark in any way." The development of Kairos from this source explains its dual meaning as an opening, an opportunity, as a due measure, for the shot requires not only accuracy, but also the right amount of power, neither too much nor too little, in order to pass successfully through the opening. Indeed, if you look at that, how can you not say that that whole concept can be applied to revolution, in particular Lenin? There are many quotes associated with Lenin. The one I read out at the beginning is of dubious provenance, but one which is of far less dubious provenance is the idea that when you're driving a knife into something and you feel mush, you feel no resistance, keep pushing. In other words, Lenin's whole revolutionary mantra is about finding the mark and applying the right amount of force, in which case Kairos and the revolution become completely and utterly indissoluble. But the interesting thing is, again, you look at that concept on a more abstract level as I am, and trying to apply it to modern history and how, say, for example, revolutionaries would look at this idea of kairos. And it actually comes out of the field of rhetoric. Indeed, if you're going to be dealing with Roman and Greek rhetoric and uh, the sophists in particular, this is something that comes up again. And just to give a bit more context regarding that, this is Plutarch's table talk on kairos and its terms and usage in rhetoric. Plutarch gives a treatment of these issues, and what he's doing essentially is building on the example provided by another great philosopher, Isocrates. It's funny how I don't intend there to be a necessary sort of overlap between the streams I do in chronological order, but Plutarch and Isocrates, I believe the only time I've mentioned them so extensively was on a stream I did only 10 days ago when I was talking about Alexander the Great, but there we are. Divisible into two interrelated themes, the correct timing proprietary for specific topics, and the timing proprietary of frank speech, i.e. the correct use of the term kairos when used in speech. Plutarch emphasizes the importance of the orator's knowledge of kairos, where occasions arise quickly and often bring with them in public affairs sudden developments, which explains why Demosthenes, as an orator, was inferior to many, as they say, because he drew back and hesitated when the occasion called for the opposite course. On the other hand, the man who is so moved by the events which take place and the opportunities which offer themselves that he springs to his feet is the one who most thrills the crowd, attracts it, and carries with him. That is, that he who knows how knows also when to speak. Indeed, you can take this and say, okay, well, this actual notion of kairos is a rhetorical tool. It should be relegated to this very limited scope of our understanding of that term. But what is an aspect of revolution which is almost endemic? It's demagoguery, is the ability to whip up and incite a crowd to revolutionary action. So this whole idea of finding the mark, or being able to be the agent of historical time in order to bring about a great change or event, would seem again to echo with the way that such a usage of kairos is used in rhetoric in order to inspire and indeed to incite. However, there is a other meaning which I've briefly indicated with kairos, which is a deeply religious context to the whole meaning of kairos, whereby it assumes, going back to figures like Mircea Eliade, and this whole notion of the divine shedding light and repetition versus progression in history, that we are all engaging in the archetype. What I'm describing is how kairos can be used essentially to upset an established order, to be the instigation of change. But kairos here is almost indicative of something else, which is a element of permanence. And this isn't just in Christian theology, this is also in Stoic philosophy. This in particular is actually taken from Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. Any single form of activity, be it what it may, ceasing in its own due season, Chiron, suffers no ill because it have ceased, nor does the agent suffer in that it have ceased to act. Similarly then, if life, the sum total of all our acts, ceases in its own good time, Chiron, it suffers no ill from this very fact, nor is he in an ill plight who has brought this chain of acts to its end in its own due time, Chiron. The due season, Chiron, and the terminus are fixed by nature, at times when by our individual nature, as when in old age, but in any case by the universal nature, the constant change of whose parts keep the whole universe ever youthful and in its prime. All that is advantageous to the whole is ever fair and in its bloom. The ending of life, then, is not only no evil to the individual, for it brings him no disgrace, if in fact it be both outside our choice and not inimical to the general weal, but a good, since it is timely, Chiron, for the universe, bears its share in it, and is born along with it. For then is he who is born along the same path as God, and born in his judgment towards the same things, indeed, a man that is God born. In other words, all our events, the whole idea of the cycle of life and death, indeed, man's apportioned time to exist, all is conditioned within a grander cosmic cycle, a God-given order, where Chiron becomes the good time, it is the due time. These are the events where these things ought to occur, and indeed, in some senses, they must occur. If you apply this to revolution, it actually is borne out by my rather esoteric reading of things like the Russian Revolution, where you can look at it as this great battle between Christ and Antichrist from the Orthodox point of view. In which case, this would seem to be a religious act tearing asunder the catacomb, that which withholds the end of the world, in which case there was some act of religious predestination towards it. I'm becoming, far more esoteric with these interpretations, but all this to say, you can draw in the fates some general trend that interconnects all of these events, and not spuriously. I don't mean to say all these points flippantly. I think all of these single elements of wedding these concepts of time together can be further interrogated and deliver some very interesting results as a context. But if you listen to that, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Bible. It also so happens that the first Bible we have, the first New Testament, of course, we have, is the Septuagint, the Greek Bible, which, of course, in terms of the usage of time, will invariably use the term Kairos over Chronos. And in particular, I'm going to be referring to Ecclesiastes 3. To everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck what is planted, a time to kill, a time to heal, a time to break down, a time to build up, a time to weep, a time to laugh, a time to mourn, a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to gain and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silent and a time to speak, to love and a time to hate, a time of war, a time of peace. What profit has the worker from that which he labors? I have seen the God-given task with which the sons of men are to be occupied. In other words, this goes back to what someone like Mircea Eliade would regard as the universal archetype, which is every act having a significant religious element as a total cosmic order, an entire sort of way of looking at the world and participating in a religious act. So you can therefore say that looking at it as a indicative of the due time, the good time becoming the mark, the target, the time of revolutionary upheaval would be, the greatest subversion of this idea. But you can say that, one reflects the other. The good time which indicates the proper order and the time which represents the upending of that order. All this indicates that there is so much you can read in the concept of Kairos. So hopefully I've illustrated to some extent again the uses and potential misuses of the word Kairos, its etymology, and indeed the fact that this is a term that we've received from the Greek Bible, but from the various translations. The translation I was reading out there is the New King James Bible, which is the one alongside perhaps the Dewey Rems, which I will tend to read out on this channel whenever I'm reading out Bible verses. But again, Kairos has simply become time. And so I emphasize again, this is a time where the English language fails me, and I have to delve deeper into these concepts, which again were far more pertinent to a very philosophically minded people such as the Greeks, where these terms, again, the distinction between them is so significant. And this distinction is really sort of elucidated by an article by John E. Smith, The Time and the Right Times, Chronos and Kairos. And all I can really say is that when I was really first thinking about this concept, it was actually a segment by Spengler, which first really got me thinking about this several years ago, which I'm going to be reading out in a moment. But John Smith seems to be one of these historians who I'm going to credit, even though this was writing some time ago, who seems to have latched on to the same context. And actually, interestingly enough, he will admit it retroactively that he was more familiar with the potential of the word Kairos for what I was referring to at the beginning, revolutionism and the historical event in time, rather than its more pedantic usage, which is that of, Plutarch and the Sophists and Isocrates, which is that of a rhetorical device. But John Smith goes on to say, time, Chronos and Kairos. These words embrace the uniform time of a cosmic system, the time which, according to Newton, the aquiber liter fluet, and just for translation, that is simply that which flows uniformly. Again, go back all the way to the beginning and the statement by Mark Bloch, and the time of opportunity or occasion, come and gone, which marks the significant moments of historical action. So again, going back to the idea of the scientific time, the constant time, time as representing a continuum which flows uniformly, that again is indicated, and John Smith actually associates it here with the idea of Chronos, placed into contradistinction with the notion of Kairos. Chronos expresses the fundamental conception of time as measure, the quantity of duration, the length of periodicity, the age of an object or artifact, and the rate of acceleration as applied to the movement of identifiable bodies, whether on the surface or the earth or in the firmament and beyond. That again is an interesting point, because I'm going to disagree with that sort of very resolutely in terms of looking at this with broader implications of how time accelerates, because this is where elements like Kairos would seem to have an agency in and of themselves, which arrives at this whole notion of time awareness and the progression of time and epochal time. So park that little element for now. The questions relevant to this conception of time are how fast, how frequent, how old, and the answers to the questions can be given, in principle at least, in cardinal numbers or in terms of limits that approach these numbers. The other term, Kairos, points to a qualitative character of time, the special position, an event or action which occupies in a series to a season when something appropriately happens that cannot happen at any time, but only at that time, to a time that marks an opportunity which may not recur. The question especially relevant to Kairos time is when, at what time. Kairos, or the right time as the term is often translated, involves ordinality, or the conception of a special temporal position, such that what happens or can happen at the time and its significance are wholly dependent on an ordinal place in the sequence and intersections of events. Kairos is therefore peculiarly relevant to historical action and to historical inquiry, because it points to the significance and purpose of events and to the idea of constellation of events yielding results which would not be possible at other times and under other circumstances. Now, this is very interesting, because based on what I read out from Marcus Aurelius and based on what I read out from Ecclesiastes 3, it's fundamental essentially to understand that when we're looking at the due time, that which could not occur at any other time other than the good time or the right time, is because it's part of a great cosmic cycle or order. It's the same way if you look at Christian theology and you wonder if the soul is immortal. Why, say, for example, do you or I appear at this moment in history? Well, again, according to the cosmic order, it's the idea that the period from which essentially we have been assigned is the Kairos. It is the right time. It is the time essentially which is most conducive to our effect on the world in a way which again is more conducive to our overall salvation and redemption. And you have the added notions to that again, it's when Christ would arrive on earth, would also exhibit perhaps the grandest conception of Kairos, that which is elevated to the point where you have the incarnation, God made flesh. And then we come to this notion, which, to a cynical historian like myself, appeals greatly, this idea of the event under which no other circumstances essentially could bring around that result. In other words, if you look at history and try and divorce it from everything that I've just said about due time or right time as a cosmic cycle, and you instead look at history as a series of incredibly nuanced and particular events, when people try and draw connections and vast laws of human action and history, it tends to go very badly. The less granular you become and the more you again, extrapolate outwards in order to determine and try and impose broader trends upon human action, simply because historians looking at human subjects existing within time and subject to so much context and interaction with space and other humans at that time should realize that this is an act that can never be repeated. It is historically unique. And in that situation, if we're going to have an element of the Kairos, of a historical action, by definition, you can almost say Kairos can only occur at that certain time. At any other time, again, the pure sort of replication of results, it would seem almost impossible. But that is where, again, I would see and where the author here expresses a similar sentiment, that due to the incredibly particular notion, the nuanced notion of historical time, we can therefore have Kairos as a very specific element which is directly associated with the historical event, the action. Now, this is significant again because I was alluding earlier to the fact that I was talking about Bergson's idea of the durée, the rhythm of subjective interpretations of history, and how that sort of acted as the counterpoint to Kant, and how that undergirds so much of this conversation. Then talking about the longue durée, and how we're trying to look at a history which is not determined by what Smith would basically identify here, which is the history of Kairos, the history of events, but the history sans events. That essentially is what many people are sort of attracted to the Annales school for, in the sense that it's very historically heterodox, and the fact it is not so much focused on the history of events so much as the longue durée. But if you again really dissect this term, as I'm about to, it will become apparent that as much, say for example, as Fernand Braudel would like to, Fernand Braudel would like to remove himself from this idea of historical action, even the longue durée is pregnant with this whole idea of Kairos. And I'll just go over this particular segment, which was taken from the preface to On the Mediterranean, the World in the Age of Philip II, which is his most famous treatise. There is a history, almost out of time, and tells the story of man's contact with the inanimate, as if the flowers did not return each spring, as if the flocks were frozen in their migrations, and as if the ships did not have to sail on an actual sea which changes as the seasons change. In other words, a man which is essentially conditioned by his environment. Over and above this unaltering history, there is a history of gentle rhythms, of groups and groupings, of social history. How did these deep running currents affect the surface of Mediterranean life? Already here, there is a little aspect of the Bergson treatise on the durée entering in, the gentle rhythms of history. These aren't the great events which seem again to cause the years to happen within days, as the sort of pseudo Lenin here would describe. However, they are significant enough again to imbue our understanding and progress of time and events with a little bit of human agency. Imbuing this with a little bit of human agency would seem sufficient, as far as I'm concerned, to say that these are the results of human action, historical action. This isn't simply an element of history that can simply be delivered as that which is determined by a chronology of events, and that which is essentially permanent. The only thing which is to identify it is the inhuman aspects of all of that. Indeed, Spengler recognizes this element of associating the Kairos, or the event in history. And so in contrast to someone like Braudel, he would look at all history essentially as being the history of the city. Out in the countryside, where humanity is far more subjective to the natural environment, it is within the city that all of the great social upheavals and innovations are derived and will eventually become propagated as a result of the Industrial Revolution and the revolution in transportation. But Braudel then goes on to say, then there is the history which Francois Simeond calls l'histoire événementielle, the history of events, a surface disturbance, the waves stirred up by powerful movement of tides, a history of short, sharp, nervous vibrations, ultra-sensitive by definition. The slightest movement sets all in its gauges quivering. Again, that would seem again to allude to what Bergson was saying earlier about the formidable imposing itself on our conception of what is essentially a transition. And all of these things, again, would indicate Kairos. The L'Histoire événementielle is the greatest rebellion against this idea of constant chronological time without this notion of upheaval or agency. As far as I'm concerned, all of these instances are kairotic. It's not fair enough to say essentially that, one represents Chronos and one represents the event in history. I believe the event in history, even in terms of the cosmic understanding we have of the due time, if you look at agriculture, you look at the passage of the seasons, you look at humans being subject to their environment, humans again having to base their existence around harvest, then even then you would have to accept that there is an element of Kairos, which is imbued in that understanding of history. You can say, as Braudel says, that this is man's contact with the inanimate. How more inanimate can you get than Chronos, history, which is simply indicative of measure? But even then, Kairos is imbued in that element of man's so-called contact with the inanimate. So John Smith then goes on to say, and substantiate this whole idea of time, and indeed the whole notion of Kairos as time which has a qualitative element. There are situations in which Friedrich Hegel, again a very famous German philosopher of history, probably the first philosopher of history in the semantic sense, who I will eventually get round to covering, I'm sure, concept of the transition from quantity to quality, where the temporal aspect of the development sets the critical time apart from any time. In other words, as far as Smith is concerned, the Kairos versus the Chronos, or the utter indifference of the temporal units and measurement to the qualitative character of the outcome. Again, this whole notion that there is the event, there is this subjective interpretation of time, or even now really what he's talking about, even the conception of a qualitative value of time is a notion of time awareness, which goes back to the whole sort of title of this stream, which is Zeitbewusstsein. Again, I apologize if all these concepts seem quite sort of difficult and heavy to sort of encounter for the first time, but I'm really trying to get at, you can say, a core element of the historical experience again, which is the historian's relationship with time, and time is seeming to have an agency all of its own. Indeed, the context for this stream is again limited by the relationship between Kairos and Chronos. I mean, the whole notion of the divinization of history, time as God, can make can be the basis of the stream in and of itself. Indeed, it's something I've actually tried to limit in terms of my understanding, and really focusing on this idea of the qualitative subjective interpretation of time in history. A parallel point can be made in connection with history. As J.H. Randall has pointed out, history does not designate the mere occurrence of events in secret, but is concerned with their significance. Our name, he writes, for the record of such occurrences is a chronicle. If the New York Times had been published from the first day of creation, we should have the most valuable chronicle of human history. But without further appraisal of what had been significant, we would still have no history. This, for reference, was taken from J.H. Randall's Nature and Historical Experience in 1958. And I look at that and I find it very amusing, as if the New York Times today especially can be perceived as having an unbiased chronological account of human action. um, but nevertheless, that was his rather flawed interpretation of essentially how to distinguish chronology from history, because he's correct in a core element, which is that what is history is essentially what the historian deems to be significant. I know that sounds incredibly reductive, but every historian is wedded to his history in a way, say, for example, which is far more intimate than the relationship between a scientist and the natural sciences. The important point is that the determination of that significance will involve recourse to all the other kairoi, I multiple kairos, or turning points in the historical order, the opportunities presented opportunities seized upon, opportunities missed, the qualitative changes and transitions in the lives of individuals and nations, and those constellations of events which made possible some outcome that could not have happened at any other time. Indeed, one fascinating thing, which again endears me to this whole notion of Kairos, is if it is the appropriate time or the opportune time, then it almost necessitates looking at history as a series of counterfactuals, because it's not simply a matter of looking at history as one thing after another. If you're going to write the antithesis of what I'm trying to do here in the stream, it's just history as one damn thing after another. But what I'm basically trying to say is that Kairos actually engenders in one the ability to see history not just as the event which has occurred, but a series of potential events. And indeed, another sort of subtle indicator of this whole notion of a qualitative aspect of time is that there are elements where the historical opportunity was missed, where the rhetorical device, the Kairos, was not used in terms of being able to win over an argument, where there was an inversion, there was a failure, there was a lack of imagination, or whatever, in which case you can almost dedicate an entire thesis on where Kairos ought to have occurred, or where Kairos essentially failed to occur. Turning now to the features of Kairos in time, it's important to note that there are three distinct but related concepts. The first, the idea of the right time, for something to happen in contrast to any time, a sense that is captured nicely with the word timing, as when we say the governor's timing was poor, he related the story to the press too soon and thus lost the advantage of surprising his political opponents. Second, Kairos means a time of tension and conflict, a time of crisis, implying that the course of events poses a problem that calls for a decision at that time, which is to say that no generalized solution or response, supposedly valid at any or every time, will suffice. And third, Kairos means that a problem or crisis has brought with it an opportunity. Kairos can be translated into Latin as opportunitas, which of course comes to us as opportunity, for accompanying some purpose which could not be carried out at any other time. Implicit in all these meanings embraced by Kairos is the concept of an individual time having a critical, ordinal position set apart from its predecessors and successors. In other words, just confirming the hypothesis that all of these events are incredibly contingent on the circumstances. The Kairos in history, the events cannot have occurred at any other time. And so again, it just builds into this whole notion that history cannot be replicated. And the whole notion of Kairos, of the event that can only happen in its due time, would seem to almost crystallize it, almost elevate it as a concept, the idea of history and its non-replicatability. So now I want to look at this and I want to move us away from identifying Kairos and placing it in a distinction with Chronos, and instead looking at this whole notion of time awareness, and indeed how Chronos, how trying to technologically keep abreast with the notion of time and our understanding of the event can actually inform our subjective understanding and awareness of time itself. The first sort of real kind of confrontation I had in terms of this idea came from Oswald Spengler in his Decline of the West, where he wrote this in his introduction. Among the Western peoples, it was the Germans who discovered the mechanical clock, the dread symbol of the flow of time, and the chimes of countless clock towers that echo day and night over Western Europe. It is perhaps the most wonderful expression of which a historical world feeling is capable. Again, world feeling, Weltanschauung, coming back to this idea of zeitgeist, spirit of the times. Indeed, just to substantiate that, reading his footnote, it was about 1000 AD, and therefore contemporaneously with the beginning of the Romanesque style and the Crusades, the first symptom of a new soul, that Abbot Geber, later Pope Sylvester II, a friend of the Emperor Otto III, invented the mechanism of the chiming wheel clock in Germany. So again, he's deliberately associating it with Christianity, and a part of not just Spengler's hypothesis, but Koselleck's hypothesis, who really is going to become the great source for the rest of the stream, is this notion of time chronometry and cataloguing and the anticipation of the future and perhaps the end of the world is associated with our understanding of time itself. And then he goes on to say, in the timeless countryside and cities of the classical world, we'd find nothing of the sort of the clock. Till the epoch of Pericles, the time of day was estimated merely at the length of the shadow, and it was only from that of Aristotle that the word ora received the Babylonian significance of hour. Prior to that, there was no exact subdivision of the day. In Babylon and Egypt, water clocks and sundials were discovered in the very early stages, yet in Athens it was left to Plato to introduce a practically useful form of clepsydra, and this was merely a minor adjunct of everyday utility, which could not influence the classical life feeling in the smallest degree. Indeed, this speaks to something very interesting regarding, again, why I'm phrasing this as a historical concept, our understanding of time, but how there is also a progression and a chronology of the development of our relationship with time itself. I am going to present a history of the development of time and uh, time, time and mechanics and that sort of thing, because looking at the Alexander the Great stream, again, what surprises a lot of people when I brought this up actually, and it surprised uh, uh, Classical Odyssey when I was trying to sort of explain this concept for the first time, is that the Greeks did not have a progressive calendar. The Greeks had this, date, which wasn't really a date. It was, we understand it as 776 BC, which is the year of the first the first Olympic Games. Thereafter, every 4 years, they had the Olympics. Hence, their whole measure of time is the Olympiad. So Alexander the Great has died in the year of the 113th Olympiad. That would almost seem to be ridiculous, wouldn't it? Christians date the before Christ and the Anno Domini and the year of our Lord, and yet to have something which, especially to us, would seem so insignificant as the games, which of course to the Greeks had a huge cultural and religious significance, it would seem less absurd. But the point again is, if you look at figures like Herodotus, one of the remarkable things you can say, one of the things which a lot of people dislike about Herodotus is the belief that he saw previous eras and times of having no value in and of themselves. And then we have the whole notion of, why write history? Well, history is simply for the sake of writing for the sake of posterity and nothing else. And then you had this whole notion of cyclic time. The world sort of goes through a series of stages. And so this whole progressive system of time, where there is the beginning, the inception, the incarnation, the Christ, and then the end of the world, would seem again antithetical to this whole version of civilization. But that again is simply to indicate that as far as there was awareness and time in pagan Greece before Christianity, it was substantially at variance with our own. Again, emphasizing this concept of Zeitbewusstsein, time consciousness. So here I have you can say, for lack of a better expression, a overview of the history of chronometry. And this is where I'm going to start reading from Reinhart Koselleck. In particular, this is his book on the practice of conceptual history, and I'll be going over most of his major works when it comes to conceptual history that have been translated into English. In order to be able to live and work, humans depend on time limits that are pre-given by nature. In other words, this is simply night and day, and of course apply to the months and seasons. They remain dependent on such limits even when they increasingly learn to manipulate these times more and more through technology or medicine. I will recall a well-known joke from the Soviet Union, sleep faster, comrade, to indicate a natural limit that cannot be transcended by any planning. In other words, that's a joke about the whole Soviet Union as having to be able to transform nature. The transformation of nature assumes that, kind of like with Lysenkoism, everything can be made to conform with communist principles. So what better way to essentially, abolish the cosmic order and assume the triumph of Marxism, Leninism on Earth than the perpetual day? The idea of the perpetual day essentially would almost sort of lend itself theoretically to this whole concept, but of course we know it as an absurdity. The times of the day and the seasons were guiding forces for the first self-organization of human society. The habits of deer for hunting cultures, location, climate, and weather conditions for farming cultures. All this embedded within the seasons shaped every day and induced magical religious attitudes, modes of behavior that oriented by them. This is still valid even today, although decreasingly so, correspondingly to the decline in the food producing sector, which now amounts to fewer than the percentage of the employees within our society. In other words, when we get to, especially by the 1990s, later sort of era of Soviet Union, and sort of at the same time that the one-child policy in China was seen as this bizarre throwback to a period of scarcity. The post-scarcity world is actually fundamentally anti-conducive to what was elucidated in Meditations and indeed by Ecclesiastes, the whole notion that agriculture in particular forms an entire world cycle, a cosmic order. Eliminate that, and you're essentially destroying one of the pillars of a traditional society. Hence why Spengler would identify revolution and progression in times being associated with the city, and of course, the emanation of the world city. In other words, the natural time prerequisites of our lives can never be eliminated. Rather, they have their own history. Ethnologists report how deeply earlier measurements of time remained embedded within the context of human action. In Madagascar, there still exists the temporal unit of the time it takes to cook rice, or of the moment that is necessary to roast a locust. Temporal measure and cause of action are still completely convergent. Such expressions are more concrete than, for instance, the blink of an eye, Augenblick in German, in our language, which is likewise a natural unit of time. It should again be referenced in terms of my own usage of words and concepts, is that Koselleck, of course, is writing in German for a German audience and with a awareness of German history and German historical writing. And so all of his terms are firmly grounded in an understanding of German history, which, if anything, like I said, it divorces so much of this conversation from what I believe is the capabilities of English historiography. Even the elementary chronometers of advanced civilizations, which indicate the course of time via a decrease in matter, sand or water, were still adapted to the enactment of concrete actions. They measure the length of a sermon, or determine the hour of a mass, or, like Cicero's water clock, of an address to the jury in court. These elementary chronometers were supplemented by sundials, depending on the season or geographical location, and at different times, since these indicators were based in nature itself. Even mechanical clocks were able to adjust to this condition. As late as the 19th century, Japanese used clocks of a particularly artful design. The way the hand and face indicated the hours was kept variable so that depending on the season, the hour of the day was in reverse relation to the hour of the night, that is, longer during the summer and shorter during the winter. By the way of these clocks, the seasonal difference between the hours of the day and those of the night entered directly into the rhythm of work from which they received their purpose. This particular moment is of quite significant interest to me because I think the usage of the mechanical clock in Japan is one of these great pieces of evidence that we have as to why the Meiji Restoration, the quote unquote rapid industrialization and westernization of Japan was possible, because Japan had an intimate and in some ways obsessive desire to voraciously imbibe learning and information that was coming out of the West, albeit in a very much controlled manner, given the authoritarian nature of Japan's feudal society of that time. And one such emanation of that, of course, is the proliferation in Japan, this, throwback feudal society, apparently by the beginning of the 19th century, the clock. Yet the introduction of the mechanical clock in the 13th century, and again, Spengler's own identification was that it was even earlier with the 11th century, already affected a new organization of the human division of time over the long term. Following some precursors in antiquity, it led to quantifying the day by means of 24 equal hours. Le Goff speaks of commercial time, the time of business people, which entered into competition with liturgical time, the time of the church, and pushed it more and more into the background. The mechanical clock, once it had been invented, descended from the church tower to the town and the city halls, then moved into the living rooms of the wealthy and the bourgeoisie, and finally found its way into watch pockets. Just a little note on that reference you brought up to liturgical time, if you do something which I guess would be seem rather sort of overly sort of fanatical to many of you, which is attend mass every day. This is equally, actually, this is applicable both to the Novus Ordo and the Latin Mass, or the so-called Mass of John the 23rd, because an entire an entire map, theological map of the year, accounted in the sermons relating it to the feast days and the saints' days, is recounted within this liturgical time. So to people attending Mass, especially pre-Vatican II, again, you could almost set your understanding of relationship of the time and the seasons based on the sermon that's being delivered. Since the 16th century, this clock has been able to indicate minutes, and since the 17th century, seconds. It indicated but also stimulated a disciplining and rationalizing of the world of human work and its latitude for action. In the first half of the 19th century, numerous industrial workers in England already carried their own watches as status symbols, but they also had to check on the supervisors' watches. With the emergence of the railroad traffic system and its standardization and schedule, were finally introduced in Prussia. Before the Revolution of 1848, which completely differed from the respective local time and the position of the sun, Henry Ford began his career as an industrialist by producing clocks that were able to indicate standard time and local time simultaneously on two faces, a final indication of the development of units of time made necessary by technology, which became separated from nature-bound traditional rhythms of time. Day and night seemed to become more alike, just as tracks made it possible for railroads to run at night. This corresponded to the introduction of night work in large companies of that of the last century, so as to increase production. What does this retrospective look at the history of chronometry in everyday life mean? We are dealing with a long-term process of increasing acts of abstraction designed to remove humans from what was naturally pre-given to them. First, chronometry was inserted into the human context of action. Second, the sundial made it possible to, as it were, objectify natural time. Third, the mechanical clock and later the pendulum clock initiated a reshaping of everyday life through quantified, uniform units of time, which pervaded and casually affected social organization and economic production. One can also say that this denaturalization of the division of time and of the experience of time included in it. In this course of mechanization, physical instruments of measurement have increasingly contributed to divesting the course of everyday life of its natural preconditions, a process that has been interpreted both as a relief and as a burden. In other words, if we're going to reduce this back to science and look at chronology and look at time essentially as this fixed continuum, what the historian focused on temporality and the history of time is doing here in the form of Koselleck with the whole history of chronology is saying that chronology was actually something that grew and intensified in the historical consciousness. Our awareness of chronological time increased as a result of the effects of the Industrial Revolution. And it, in its turn, affected a whole social transition and a whole reconditioning of the human mind. And again, out of the quote unquote natural rhythms, which accorded with the old traditions of farming, with the advent of industrialization, a whole new mechanical system of time is essentially made necessary in order to replace it. Of course, you can then extend it, and we have globalization, and you have working from home, and these whole notions of night into day, and being able to turn the universe on its head uh, are demonstrated abundantly. I mean, me doing this stream, I'm doing this late at night in my own time, but it also appealed to the fact that many of you listening to this will be listening at various times at your inconvenience, as if again to indicate that I am in many ways indicative of this trend to surpassing the natural condition of rhythms of traditional time in order to deliver this lecture on the notion of historical time. This tells us this retrospective tells us other things. There is the history of chronometry, which affects social changes in everyday life, but there is the interpretation of denaturalization that takes on meaning, though with the reservation that to this day all forms of chronometry mentioned have remained dependent upon our planetary systems, on the revolution of the Earth around the Sun, on that of the Moon around the Earth, though less so, and on the turning of the globe around its axis. In other words, regardless of the social function of the retrospective form of chronometry, any form of chronometry remains embedded in scientifically verifiable and, in this sense, objective data. The data of the solar system were already calculated with great precision by astronomers of advanced civilizations in the second millennium BC by the Maya. They are valid regardless of history, regardless of the historical situation in which they were first ascertained. Not without reason, chronology is called an auxiliary science of history. It answers questions of dating, referring numerous calendars and chronologies that have been used in the course of history back to a common time of our planetary system, which is calculated in a physical astronomical manner. Indeed, if you go to the French Revolutionary calendar, this was an issue that the French revolutionaries were having to deal with, which was, okay, well, we want to make everything into decimal time. You know, however, look at the year. There are 365 and a quarter days in a year. That actually can't figure into our whole notion of decimal time. So when they were recreating the months, they standardized the months all to be 30 days, but of course that left them with 5 1/4 additional days. And so they inserted additional superfluous days at the beginning of the year as revolutionary festivals. This also accompanying with the change of the week, which again would actually seem to indicate a natural rhythm. The changing of the week from 7 days to 10 days would seem again less dramatic than violating the lunar cycles or even the solar cycles. But even then, the trend towards 7, Sunday or not, um, is seemingly again indicative of a natural pattern of human behavior that even today we haven't been able to abolish the 7-day week and have it superseded by say the decade of the French revolutionaries. With the inception of overseas land acquisition, the number of calendars competing in Europe around 1600, the Julian, the Gregorian, the Byzantine, and the Muslim, increased by several chronologies. Employing different sequence of numbers, they also refer to objectively equal dates of the same natural time. Scaliger, for instance, defined January the 1st, 4713 BC, as the day one, from which every day and every year was to receive its natural identity, to which all calendars could be referred. Indeed, this goes back to the whole notion that would elevate the Byzantine Julian calendar, say, for example, to the Russians, is that their calendar again dated from the year of creationism. And of course, there was a slight variance with the days, which means that the October Revolution, going back to Russia, was actually the November Revolution, which the Russians themselves were acknowledged when they changed their own calendar in 1923. It's very interesting looking at all these variations in natural chronology, but then, of course, we have to sort of go back to the prefiguring, say, for example, the role of Christ. So Christ was born on December the 25th of the year 1 BC, and ironically, that is itself an error. It's more likely that Christ would have been born in the year 4 BC, and the date of his execution would have been 29 BC. So even in our attempts to modify chronology to religiously pertinent dates, we still have gross errors. And of course, we can't actually then supersede and abolish all our time in order to basically modify for that original error in accounting. But Koselleck goes on and states that he wants to emphasize the following: our entire chronometry, in minutes and hours, in units of years and centuries, and which we artificially create, is based on regularity and cyclical return of natural pre-given dates. For historical chronology, at least, time is measurable only because it is a natural occurrence. So in conclusion, on the topic of Chronos, our subjective interpretation and our relationship with Chronos has intensified significantly over the course of the last 1,000 years. You can say, beginning with the invention of the mechanical clock, it really seems that the second millennium is the millennium of Chronos, and that we arrive at the church tower, and then we arrive essentially at the point now where we can't escape time, whether it be on our devices, our phones, or whatever. Fewer people have watches, let alone pocket watches. A few people pay attention to church clocks or whatever. But the point is that itself indicates a historical and social relationship with time, but it doesn't actually change the fundamentals, which is that Chronos, being a scientific occurrence, being fixed, does not itself change. Our relationship to Chronos can change, but in that sense, chronology remains essentially super historical. It is beyond the sort of powers of people like me to sort of reduce it to subjective interpretations and qualifiers beyond that which I've already alluded to. So now we come to Koselleck's other book, The Sediments of Time. And again, I would recommend you would go ahead and read all of these books regarding the incredible sort of wealth of conceptual history which is elucidated here. But this again is taking on the other element, which is taken in concert with this development of Chronos. The profusion and our relationship and intensification of time as measure, of course, has been identified with the rationalization of a world time system and with the advance of technology. Now we come to another element, which is how can technology itself become the agent of Kairos, the agent of revolutionary change in time? So we again return to the mechanical clock. The mechanical clock, and later the pendulum clock, began a process of reworking the everyday through quantified units of time, which helped to secure and promote a far-reaching organization of society, a process that extended from the 14th to the 18th century. The Sun King, Louis XIV, was celebrated as the Maître du Temps, literally the master of time, because he ruled the present by his wisdom, the past by his memory, and the future by his foresight. Clocks dedicated to him and those he had erected symbolize this. And again, this would, you can say, indicate the archetype that Louis XIV is there by the divine right of kings. If he is there surely by the divine right of kings, then he must transcend time itself and be indicative of all time. In the same way, again, that Christ, again, is supposed to exist within time and yet also out of time. So it's an interesting association here. But again, the deliberate association with Louis XIV and the clock as elevating his whole notion that the king and the secular authority as master of time has rather interesting implications going forward when we're talking about regimes like the Soviet Union trying to, and the French Revolution trying to modify and control it. It's important to recognize that the regularly running clocks that intrude in everyday life instigated were signs of a lasting order, but they were not signs themselves of an acceleration. Now, this is the term which Koselleck is going to be using and which arrives at my final point regarding this conversation, which is Neue Zeit, modernity, new time. Chronology really can't account for the idea that time can never increase. Our subjective interpretation of time would allow for not just qualitative time in the sense that we have the great event in history, which would seem to speed things up, but that there could be a general acceleration of time, not just one event, but a whole cascading series of events which seem to be conditioned by technology and by the very constitutions and social makeup in which we find ourselves. In other words, acceleration becomes a conscious reality in terms of our perception of time. This is really what he's trying to identify with, and he identifies it with these various revolutions to arrive at this new sense of time awareness, Zeitbewusstsein. However much they allowed for it to be measured in the physical realm, this referring back again to the clock, the dwindling hourglass and its fluid time became an allegory of essentially time past, vanitas, the vanishing time. The mechanical clock, in turn, became an allegory of constancy, of wisdom, and utility. It was only at the end of the 18th century, when the clock was fully integrated into everyday life, that it could also represent this idea of the vanishing of time. Again, just an interesting sort of point regarding the icon of the clock, that the clock could be seen to identify the ancien regime, i.e., the clock is there to represent the monarchy of a constant God-given order, what was and is and always shall be. And you then take it and say that in the modern age, the notion of time then becomes oblivion. That which is past, that shall never be repeated. Time is dead. It comes back to this thing I was elucidating when I was talking about Kant, is that you enter a bit of a sort of existential crisis when really trying to overthink about concepts of time, whereby the past is essentially dead and you essentially cease existing in order to exist in the next second. And that is, that's the whole nature of time. You are constantly, say, for example, dying in the sense that the moment that preceded you is now death. But of course, as Bergson was there to basically indicate, is that this isn't death, this is simple change, which can be indicated by transition and this feeling essentially of simultaneously of having things prolong and seem definite, yet also these great upheavals that would seem to overturn all of our notions of gentle transitions and things like that. But I want to continue on before I linger too much on that point, but just again, the subtle differentiation in terms of the identification of the clock with permanence and then with oblivion. The metaphor of the machine, especially of clockwork, that came to encompass cosmos, society, and humanity in the 17th century, was still a pre-progressive metaphor. It evoked regularity, the stable household of God, nature, or humans that had been set up and then ran steadily, but not of human acceleration, i.e., progression, or that. Because when looking at this whole idea of acceleration, progression in history, it presupposes essentially that which came before is regressive, that which cannot be returned to. Whereas if you go back again to this more hierarchical, traditional notion of time, where Kairos is to be identified with everything having a good apportioned moment, everything where there is a due moment for something to happen, even for human beings to appear on this earth. Once you take that and add this whole notion of acceleration, the past in and of itself represents a form of illegitimacy. And in that sense, again, it would act as a complete contradistinction to the whole idea of time itself representing permanence. The clock could measure acceleration, but it could not symbolize it. The first became possible with the railroad and its metaphorics. Marx spoke of revolutions as the locomotives of history, not the clocks of history. This new metaphor would indicate the threshold only after which acceleration could coalesce into the dominant mode of experience of a new generation. So whilst the clock represents a technological innovation, the locomotive, as far as Koselleck is concerned, and indeed as far as Marx is concerned, is far more indicative of this greater trend towards the acceleration of time in terms of a literal form of acceleration of transport. Pre-mechanical increases in speed have been registered in many ways since the 17th century. The expansion of networks of roads and canals increasing the volume of freight and the distance it could be transported. The motivation for this expansion could be mercantile or political. In England, which had always enjoyed the advantage of cheap, fast waterways, a network of roads was constructed shortly after the Jacobite pretender Bonnie Prince Charlie, a nice little representation of Stuart Jacobitism on this stream, had penetrated so far into England in 1745 that no troops could be mustered quickly enough to counter him. The average speed of private carriages on French roads more than doubled between 1814 and 1848, from 4.5 kilometers per hour to 9.5. In Prussia of the same period, the mail coach journey from Berlin to Cologne likewise shrank from 130 to 78 hours. That also should be mentioned as a consequence of now being part of a more or less continuous country following the Napoleonic Wars. Government investments in toll roads also made governments long hesitate to subsidize railways, thus creating cheaper competition for themselves. And this was one of the indirect causes of the 1848 revolutions. Again, this whole notion that resisting the railway, trying to break down barriers is part of the impetus in Germany behind the Zollverein, or the customs union, that having these distances be able to be traveled, at faster rates, having the trains between, Dresden and Berlin, Cologne and Stuttgart and Munich and Nuremberg, etc., is all to indicate that fundamentally there is actually very little geographically distinguishing these territories anymore. There is only one territory, and that territory is Germany. And anyone who is frustrating the expansion of the railway, anyone who is putting up these toll barriers and wanting to maintain the primacy of the roads, is not only again trying to cheat the public of good, efficient transportation, they're also trying to hold on to a decaying world, this divided piecemeal segment of the princely patch quilt work of the German Confederation, and before then the Holy Roman Empire. Just an interesting thought. We also can witness a similar process of increasing speed in sea routes. In the first decade of the 19th century, North America invented the clipper ship, a narrow sailing ship with tall masts that cut the time to travel from New York to San Francisco around the Cape Horn, which is 20,000 kilometers, from 150 days to 90 days. The record for a day was more than 750 kilometers, that is around 15 nautical miles per hour, which steam could only surpass much, much later. We can observe something similar in communications. Prior to the establishment of the electrical telegraph, Thomas Sommering had invented one in 1810, but it proved unusable. Optical telegraph networks, whose traditions stretched back to antiquity, were developed to perfection. The speed of signaling was increased enormously, whether through the necessary abbreviation of Baroque administrative texts or the construction of a system of signals transmitted from tower to tower. In the French Revolution, the system of communication, which was also a system of control, was systematically developed. The fall to the Austrians of Condé-sur-Lescaut in 1794 was reported from Lille to Paris by optical telegraph, many hours earlier, before the mounted courier arrived. Napoleon's successors were also aided by the acceleration of the transmission of the messages in this way, which were also part of the reason that the execution of the Tyrolean rebel leader Andreas Hofer, after receipt of a supposedly direct order transmitted from an optical telegraph from Napoleon, even though the majority of judges have voted against it. Just on that note, we talk about the optical telegraph being essentially an innovation of the French Revolution, but this whole notion of using towers to transport ideas quickly. I mean, this goes back all the way to the Crusades, again, talking about the invention of the clock. The inspiration behind the beacons being lit in Lord of the Rings was actually related to the siege of Kerak, which was a fortress in the Outer Jordan in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. I think it was in the 1180s. And that, again, the beacons were lit and the army of Jerusalem was assembled in order to ward off the forces of Salah al-Din, and the siege was lifted. So this whole notion of using these great sort of innovations of the pre-mechanical days of the telegraph could be seen going back hundreds of years before Napoleon would exploit them. As is so often the case, business only later caught up with political and military interests. Cases are conceivable in which having messengers arrive just a few hours earlier could be worth much more than the yearly cost of telegraph lines and all their equipment. Professor Bush noted in 1800, a guiding principle of the world of trade and finances is in the coming centuries, saving time increases costs and profits even more. Prior to the invention of new technological instruments of acceleration, the modern state and civil society had already achieved an astounding velocity in their transportation systems. However, they ran up against an absolute limit dictated by nature. Roads could be improved, coaches refined, but the power of horses remained limited. Sailing ships could be perfected, but in the end their speed depended on the wind. The optical telegraph could be rationalized, but transmission was thwarted by nightfall, or by rain and clouds in the day, not infrequently for days or weeks. Sometimes a partial report was all there was for days. Thus, victory was reported from the Peninsular War in Spain, without anyone in Paris learning as to whether Wellington or Napoleon was the victor. Once acceleration, however, was unleashed in interpersonal traffic, it could only be driven further once technological inventions allowed it to surpass nature-given limits. Only in the wake of the French Revolution and Industrial Revolutions did acceleration begin to become a universal principle of experience. The most frequent benchmark for such an acceleration was the disappearance of physical space. Again, going back to the whole notion of the relationship between time and space, well, invariably eliminate space, and it affects again the perception of time. In 1838, the Brockhaus die Gegenwart pointedly defined the essence of the railroad as follows. It does away with spatial separations, bringing things closer in time. Thus, all spaces are only distances for us. By virtue of this time, we need to pass through them. If we accelerate these times, it limits the influence of space on life and transport. The writer makes individual calculations for the world of work and politics with touching naivete, and the railroad's coming military significance is intentionally overlooked. Traveling by train, the itinerant manual laborer would gain 4.5 days of working time per week. Adjacent cities would grow together into an artificially concentrated space. The division of city and countryside would be overcome by a common economic space. Land and sea will exchange roles. Railroad will reduce Europe to approximately the size of Germany, which in turn will also facilitate German integration, unification in the 19th century as well. When looking at things like the military significance being overlooked by the capacity of the railroad, of course, the great nation to exploit the military capacity for the railroad is, of course, the Prussian army, which will use it to great effect in order to defeat the Danes, then defeat the Austrians, then defeat the French in the 1860s and 1870. So this has earth-shattering implications in all aspects of life. And of course, if there is a social function of the train, which is there to accelerate German unification, then it is the Prussian army, which is also using the train as a vehicle for unification. Again, I wasn't so much wanting this to sort of segue into a conversation as to how the acceleration of time is one of these things which brings forth concepts like German unity. It's rather interesting if you look at the French Revolution essentially as a revolution primarily of ideas which unleash many technological concepts going forward. Then conversely, you see German unification as by and large the result of innovations and the progression of physical technology rather than ideas. I'm not necessarily saying I subscribe to that view necessarily, but it's something that almost becomes apparent from reading this, that there is a very interesting angle that one can take here. The enemies of the railroad recognized and feared a democratizing effect of it, which transported all the existing estates in Germany, the Stander, in 4 classes at the same speed. It was a commonplace that the railroad initiated the age of equality. It is almost unnecessary to mention that the unification of legal spaces at the cost of traditional regional titles was part of the same inventory of experience. Again, if you take this, there is a logic behind it in the sense that the delimitations of classes in travel, of course, would reduce over time. I mean, in this country, you still have first class travel, which barely anyone uses, mainly just uh, business trips up to London. Then, of course, everyone else uses standard class. The same can also be said for flying. I think rather than trains, the element of history which people are most familiar with regarding the rigid class distinctions is actually the luxury cruise liner, in particular the transatlantic cruise liner, which it should also be mentioned were a great German innovation as much as they were an innovation of White Star Line and Cunard, etc. If you look to Berlin and Hamburg, America. And the story of the Titanic, you can say, crystallizes again this bizarre contradiction in the sense that you have the class distinction, yes, but you are simultaneously all using the same method of transportation. So you're all traveling as one, yet there is the pretense made again to distinguish the nature of the travel. Again, it's basically you take the different forms, the carriage ride versus, the sort of long forlorn walk, or the sort of cart wagon of the peasant, and then you try and sort of amalgamate it into one concept, which appears as the train, and appears as the cruise liner, and then in itself it becomes, rightly or wrongly, a potential source of revolutionary animosity once the classes are juxtaposed to one another, all existing in the same space. I mean, if you look at the Uffizi and Florence and the whole structure of the center of Florence, it was designed in part that the Medicis could travel independently from the citizens of the city. In that way, one thing that distinguishes class distinctions is that we all travel separately. We do not travel in the same vehicle, albeit essentially in different adjoining rooms. But acceleration was also registered in other areas which are unrelated to this aspect of the railroad. I mean, I've already mentioned it with the cruise liner. Adam Smith's division of labor does not simply induce corresponding growth of the productive powers, but it also helps to save time by gaining time that would otherwise have been lost from moving from one kind of work to another. This gain in time has significantly increased the quantity of work. Ultimately, wages are saved with the gain in time, and machines are to thank for it all. The working time freed up in this way should in turn be used for the satisfaction of the new needs which emerge because the machines have already satisfied the existing ends. And a further interpretation, again, you can take from this is that this intensifies the whole notion of the mechanization of labor and the mechanization of man, and again, the whole Marxist arguments regarding the whole alienation of the condition of the unskilled worker, etc. It all sort of lends itself as a result of this form of argumentation. Luxury lost the stigma of being the purview merely of the upper classes. Instead, need was transformed into the need for the increase of need through the accelerated shift in fashions, something recognized by Garve. Instead of simply satisfying the most basic needs required by nature, growing needs now put pressure on the order of the estates. There was a growing perception of widespread processes that were experienced as acceleration and could not be reversed. I mean, I've already alluded to it with the whole sort of basis of travel. But yes, if you look to fashion, even the creation of the first malls, the first large shopping outlets and stores towards the end of the 19th century, so much of how we would distinguish hierarchy in the previous eras was based around either prescribed or implicit assumptions around sumptuary laws, that the more decadent and ostentatious you were, it was supposed to again indicate your nobility. But once fashions become, first of all, they become a bourgeois phenomenon, then they become further democratized from that. The social distinctions that could be ascertained simply by appearance have basically ceased to exist, especially today. Acceleration seemed to take hold of one realm after another, not merely the technical work of industry, the empirically verifiable core of acceleration, but everyday life, politics, the economy, and the population increases as well. Again, a fundamental aspect of the development of technology is that the whole sort of Malthusian system of economics, where there is a definite sort of upper sort of echelon of potential population, which once that exceed will result in famines. It still pervades, it should be mentioned, quite a lot of, I would say, political analysis, for better or worse. But nevertheless, this was one of the aspects in quote unquote post scarcity that technology was able to remedy, and in many ways stupefy people's expectations. The bourgeois world unfolded under the signs of acceleration. Ever more pianos, the mark of distinction of every bourgeois salon, were produced in ever shorter periods of time. In 1750, a piano maker produced around 20 instruments. Thanks to the mechanical production of metal frames, Broadwood of London manufactured 400 pianos in 1802 and 1,500 in 1824. Prices sank, pitch rose and reached a brilliant frequency of 435. Mozart and Beethoven were irritated that their pieces were being played faster than they had intended. Reading in the bourgeois household was likewise accelerated. Repeated readings of the Bible and the classics shifted to include the consumption of constantly new literary products, above all the novel. I mean, Cervantes is often again credited with the creation of the first modern novel, in the sense of Don Quixote, but really you can say the novel is as much in terms of English, very much an 18th century invention. And so again, the profusions that we see, not just in terms of the mechanical outputs regarding piano construction, but also publishing and the popularization of mass literature, essentially. We have the novel, and of course, we have the newspaper, albeit this, in terms of acceleration, is something you can attribute to much, much earlier, as early as the Gutenberg press in the late 15th century, which is a point I'm going to come back to right at the very end. Indeed, the increasing use of the term acceleration since the turn of the 19th century bears witness to a change in the sensation of consciousness of that time, and the terms that Koselleck uses are Zeitgefühl, which basically means time sense, and ultimately the term that I decided to use for this stream, which is Zeitbewusstsein, time awareness, the awareness of acceleration, without the everyday use of language necessary for having any kind of theoretical or systemic stringency. Indeed, looking at this, it should be apparent to many of you that this could actually seem quite... The whole notion that time itself is accelerating and has a progressive element, again, it's something that I haven't encountered to the great extent that it would basically, satisfy my curiosity. Let's just put it that way. When we have notions of historical predeterminism and things like that, it tends to be trying to create these grandiose systems of historical frameworks, which I've already basically stated I'm loath to use. But this argument about the subjective interpretation and awareness of acceleration within that period, again, is very interesting. It would seem that the term served to register an experience that had not existed before. Of course, this is precisely the point of acceleration. The question as to acceleration is part of a more general question which constitutes historical time. If we categorize progress as the first genuinely historical category of time, which it is, despite its historical theological implications, then acceleration is a specific variety of this progress. Now that is a very interesting statement. Progress as the first genuinely historical category of time. Historical in the sense that when looking at Kairos, when looking at Chronos, I mean, these are terms that are born out of, Greek mythology and etymology. In the case of Kairos, again, it was born out of the use of rhetoric. But what I believe he's generally trying to say here is that with this whole notion of acceleration, the popular understanding of acceleration, progression within history, times are changing, we're moving towards modernity. This self-conception, this awareness of the time, makes it a fundamental historical category of time, something that was so evident to ordinary bystanders, let alone historians and onlookers and polemicists, that it was worthy of notice. This is essentially what I mean by trying to take Kairos and see all of the applications you can use for it for history. Again, if Kairos is the due time or finding the mark, then Kairos in this instance would again seem to be the agent of historical action personified through acceleration. But it takes on a very different meaning if you try to look at acceleration and Kairos and try to draw a connection between them, because Kairos would seem to have a very particular association with the right event at the right time. This goes back to the historical argument I was referring to earlier, that it is the vast variety of historically contingent and contextual situations that ensure that one event in history can't be repeated. It is unique. There is, of course, again, the theological notion that every event, again, must occur in its due time, in good time, where there is a cosmic order that's been associated with it. With Kairos, here, with acceleration, and my interpretation of it and trying to extrapolate this from what Koselleck is saying, I would almost say that Kairos, in terms of looking at revolutionism, Kairos is taking on the inverse of this cosmic order. Kairos here is no longer referring to a specific instance or an opportunity which has been missed, an opportunity lost, or a mark, essentially a target to be identified with, but it becomes far more nebulous. It is simply that there is an agency which is afforded to the manifestation of so many of these technological and ideological developments happening simultaneously, that for the first time it would seem that there is a popular perception of historical agency which is ascribed to time itself and not to any one individual, such as the multitude that basically allows us to arrive at a true conception of a historical moment in time. I know I'm not necessarily expressing it that well, but if we look again at tradition and agricultural societies as having their due time, here Kairos would seem to be the inverse of that. It is the impetus towards the obliteration of everything that came before it. It is time which has become subordinated to progress, to revolution. Theoretically, there can also be progress that moves uniformly, so that the simple speed of change or improvement does not represent an additional criterion for something progressively changing. Rise in production, for example, can remain the same in uniform intervals of time. It is only if productivity is increased that it becomes an acceleration of production. Again, that's another interesting note, that if all things increase at the same time in a uniform and predictable manner, it would almost seem that we're moving on from progress being associated with an element of historical agency or kairos. We're now actually extrapolating this to mean that it's almost as if chronology is being upended by this concept. No longer can we have fixity and permanence in a continuum of time as science understands it, but progress and acceleration seem so inexorable that it seems that chronology itself is being affected by it, at least subjectively. And as we know, and as there have been so many attempts to ground this idea, as much as we may attempt to, again, to reduce everything to subjective qualifications, time is still time. So what I'm really identifying here is how people view this, how the subject essentially identifies the indicators, the chronology of time. It is only when rates measured in identical intervals of this time increase geometrically, rather than arithmetically, that we can register something like acceleration. Thus, around 1900, Henry Adams considered the entirety of modern history in terms of the law of acceleration. This would be called backdating. The model is useful as a heuristic determination of the technological industrial conditions of modern history, but it cannot be applied in an unmediated way to general history, by that essentially saying that as being part of a phenomenon, Henry Adams was essentially trying to apply what was a developing situation, a unique situation within world history, and then trying to ascribe it to all history uniformly. And of course, the whole notion of time and progress as being a new time, a neue Zeit, a new period, a new epoch within history, would seem again to demarcate it as an event unique. At any rate, it is clear to us that acceleration is more than simple change and more than mere progress. It qualifies a progress of history, a phrase that was first employed after 1800. Change, mutatio rerum, which just means the change, the mutation of the thing or the change of the thing, is reported in all histories, as it should be, because that essentially is history. The kind of change that calls forth a new experience of time, the sense that everything is changing more quickly than one had expected or experienced up to that point, is modern, however. Shorter time spans bring us a component of unfamiliarity into everyday life of those affected, and this component cannot be derived from any other experience. As Goethe and Edward say in the Elective Affinities, it is a great annoyance that one can no longer learn anything once and for all. Our ancestors observed their whole life long the instruction they received in their youth, but we have to learn anew every 5 years if we do not want to fall completely out of fashion. In other words, rhythms, the process of time, are articulated that can no longer be derived from natural time of any sequence of generations. And this, I think, is the most sort of archetypal idea of Bergson's rhythmic history as represented by the durée. Again, it's no surprise that Bergson was writing these ideas around this exact same time. The former constant reproducibility of learning, the lasting application of what had been learnt, are interrupted for the mastery of what is now new. Compared to the preceding experience of learning, the temporal rhythms of relearning become shorter and shorter, which calls forth the experience of an accelerated transformation. This kind of acceleration refers to a history that is conceived of as a time that is always outpacing itself, as it were, as modernity, Neuzeit in German, in an emphatic sense. Again, this whole notion, I've always wondered if, to what extent Bergson had any influence on Koselleck at all, because almost a structural point behind this stream in terms of choosing the terminology is that I almost feel that I'm going to be leaning on a French tradition or a German tradition, with the Greek tradition, of course, being inevitable in either case. But it seems that I ultimately decided to opt for the German tradition here. Here it is necessary to make a second point, which should serve as a warning against positing the concept of modernity as absolute. Acceleration is always a concept which is taken on from the point of view of perspective. It takes its evidence from comparison of contemporaneous generations who share a common space of experience, even if the space is also perspectively refracted. In other words, again, modernity is such because everyone has a conception of modernity. Wondering at the unbelievable speed with which his age was transformed, all thought and intention, the German publisher Perthes formulated this in a letter to Jacobi. Previously, there had only been transformations in experience over the course of centuries. Now the sequence of different experiences is compressed together and expands the discord accordingly. Our time has unified what is completely ununifiable in 3 generations that are now currently alive. The immense contrasts of 1750, 1789, and 1815 lack any and all transition and appear not as a sequence but as a coexistence in the people now alive, depending on whether one is grandfather, father, or grandson. It is the chronological contemporaneity of those who are not political or socially contemporaneous that calls forth conflicts, where attempts to resolve these conflicts are experienced as acceleration when measured against previous epochs. Now, I'm going to be drawing a lot of comparisons to how this is relevant to modern day, but this segment in particular is incredibly relevant to modern day. The delineation between boomers, Gen Xers, millennials, and Zoomers. It is essentially a standard talking point, at least. Whether actual sort of historical record and scientific theory will have this borne out in the long term is another matter. But we're talking about popular perceptions. And the perception, especially among my sort of generation, which are the Zillennial generation versus Gen Xers and boomers, is that we basically occupy completely different world spaces, completely different world outlooks. Weltanschauung. Boomers in particular, that would seem to almost make mutual coexistence incompatible ideologically, because we are existing in different mental realms. On the one hand, this whole notion of acceleration requires a process of relearning to the point that, again, it's about keeping up with fashion. Yet at the same time, you have whole generations who are stuck in quote unquote outmoded mentalities. And this is causes a huge amount of social strife, which again is one of the great detriments and subversions of progress, where once you had, again, tradition, hierarchy, and the whole identification of the clock as a situation of permanence, what was, what is, and what always shall be. Now it is a situation where there is not just, again, war between the generations, but war between the sexes, and you can expand this out to include all other groups. But this particular generational conflict, again, is the product of modernity. The whole notion, again, of the youth being necessarily more radical than the preceding generation is a modern concept. It's a modern concept, again, because it assumes that time is always moving at such a pace in which the zeitgeist which affects the new generation will be fundamentally at variance with the old, whatever that is. That was always presupposed to mean that the new generation would be more progressive, more left-wing, but has now arrived at the situation where even those whole notions are being upturned. So it's now arrived at the situation where we have acceleration, but acceleration is no longer being uniquely identified with progress. And this is where you get the whole sort of fear of the regressive element encroaching in history and modernity. Our category of acceleration can thus also serve as an instrument of knowledge that aims at a theory of political crisis, one that would not necessarily claim future accelerations. The French Revolution and its course were conventionally understood, but in this way. George Friedrich Rebmann, for example, composed a funeral elegy for the French revolutionary calendar that was revoked in 1805, the year of the second year of Napoleon's empire, in which he offers a typology of the revolution that had created it, adding, in short, the calendar saw everything that had happened in the 20 centuries before it in the space of just a few years, and just as child prodigies rarely grow old, it finally died of stroke, even though the doctors had prophesied a death by consumption. Oh, if the calendar had only been able to experience how people could become cleverer and better, how their experiences had become useful for them and their descendants. Here, the topos of the compressed and therefore accelerated time of revolutionary events ends in partial resignation, since progress did not ensure the degree Rebmann hoped for, ensue to the degree Rebmann hoped for. Indeed, one interesting point that Koselleck mentions elsewhere is the idea that the creation of new time in a year zero increases the expectations on the future. In other words, once you begin to say that this is a year zero, you have built in this whole notion of the expectation of utopia, which he correctly identifies as being a religious displacement for Christianity and Protestant millenarianism in particular, the 1,000 years and the rapture and the coming of the kingdom of God and that sort of thing. The whole, again, revolutionary impetus behind this is that the revolutionary calendar had been betrayed in some way. If you look at a lot of leftist and Marxist historiography, we talk about the Thermidorian reaction and the coup of Brumaire. All of these events are basically to deprive the original spirit of accelerationism of progress, which is identified with the revolutionary calendar. The revolutionary calendar ought, in this situation, to have been the agent of a new political era, with the expectation essentially of the coming utopia, maybe as a result of Robespierre's cult of the Supreme Being. We don't know, because that simply did not occur. But nevertheless, these whole chronological revolutions create these great expectations and revolutions in our conception of historical time. Gorez reacted similarly after the Restoration, in a traditional sense, seemed to have been reinstated once more, this referring to the Restoration of the monarchy. He came to the conclusion that one could learn little from earlier history. If you want to study history, then take the Revolution as your instructor. In the course of many sluggish centuries, accelerated into a cycle of just a few years, which, of course, reaffirms the quote that I brought up at the beginning. There are years in which nothing happens, and there are days in which years happen. Here, then, we encounter an interpretational concept of acceleration that starts with a dimension of surprise at an unknown future and points back to a structural possibilities of history that can repeat itself in analogous ways. A revolution is just the accelerated concentrate of all possible history, so to speak. In this regard, accelerated history still remains a history that is not only modern. To be sure, these examples come from political experience, not of industrialization. Over the course of technologizing society in the 19th century, this political variety of acceleration was always invoked whenever revolutionary shifts occurred, but on the whole, they did not determine the interpretation of all occurrences. For this reason, there are two theoretically differentiated types of acceleration. One, which is the acceleration registered by crises in political life. There are examples of this going back to Thucydides and such early modern examples referring to unrest and civil war. Indeed, I would actually sort of look to the French Wars of Religion, essentially be my wheelhouse in terms of presaging many elements of the French Revolution, albeit in a slightly different context. Characteristic of this interpretation of the French Revolution is the often repeated thesis that the recent cascade of events, Polybius's model of constitutional cycles spread out over 9 generations, is now being compressed into the cataracts of events within a single generation, or becoming even shorter. This kind of acceleration draws in something long familiar, merely seeing it as taking place in a much shorter time period. I mean, my counter to that would be is that I almost see the French Revolution as not being nine generations succeeding each other, but rather 9 generations assaulting a situation all at once. I see the French Revolution as a revolution of many contemporaneous revolutions. If you look at the whole nature of the grievances and the structure essentially of the criticism directed at the absolute monarchy, and also if you're going to look at the whole notion of Kairos as missed opportunities or opportunities which were afforded by the circumstances at that time, the French Revolution is a cavalcade of Kairos in that sense. So you can simply say that this is speeding up of history, or you can say that this is simply a slew of succession of failed projects. In many ways, then you can actually take Kairos and invert it and say that the revolution failed because it was not a Chiron, it wasn't the event in good time. All this is to say, again, you can take my rather elastic concept of Chronos, Kairos, and time awareness, acceleration, and apply these very liberally. And indeed, you can probably draw them all together if you're going to look at an event through this certain way and draw seemingly completely contradictory elements out of it and also have a through line. So one other through line you could draw from it in terms of what I basically referenced for my esoteric reading of the Russian Revolution from an Orthodox point of view, which is the inevitable fight between the Christ and the Antichrist and the ending of the catacon, is that the French Revolution represented the end of the corrupt and moribund Capetian Gallican monarchy that essentially had, for so long erred and revolted, you can say, against the Res Publica Christiana by allying with the Turks and allying with Protestants and attempting to basically take over the powers of the emperor and the pope. You can draw so many different connections and esoteric readings of the whole nature of time to draw various conclusions out of it. I can be very cynical in saying this, is that because the historian is so wedded to their history, you can basically set out an incredibly sort of obscure hypothesis and thesis, and you can essentially ensure that with the effects of your argumentation, the evidence you use in terms of being able to present it sufficiently, and of course your way of basically being able to connect with your audience can ensure that even the most obscure and bizarre theories can almost enter into mainstream parlance. And I would actually count many mainstream historical elements in historiography as following in that sort of that mold. But finally, there is the acceleration that has resulted from technological industrial progress, in contrast to the past, that can be registered as the experience of a new time. But of course, both types of acceleration, which a theory of time must strictly differentiate, naturally blend together and influence each other. Hence, why I come back to this point where it seems that time itself has changed because of the multiplicity of these great historical events occurring in tandem in such a swift sequence as to create this indelible outcome in terms of the mind of ordinary people, let alone commentators, that this is a new time in which we're all inhabiting, even though it still takes some decades for this progression essentially to be realized. We're talking about the middle and the late 19th century. But just to further again build on this aspect regarding the French Revolution, because we've talked about the industrial elements regarding time awareness and the acceleration of time and the idea of Kairos being extrapolated much further. Going back to the French Revolution, I'm reading from Futures Past, another book by Koselleck. Behind Robespierre's vow to his fellow citizens to accelerate the French Revolution in order that freedom might be gained quickly, it is possible to detect the unconscious secularization of an eschatological expectation. In other words, that the French Revolution had a religious impulse that was bound up with the imminent arrival of an earthly utopia. From Lecantz to Luther and Bengel, temporal abbreviation was taken to be a sign of the approaching destruction of historical time in general. And this, again, you can look to the foundations of the 30 Years' War, you can look to the Rosicrucians, and say all the way to the time of Luther, that and the Protestant Reformation, that this was an expectation that was taken up again and again and recontextualized ever so slightly. But with the French Revolution, the difference is that, again, it seems to coincide with a massive technological revolution, to the point that it seems that these concepts, in terms of their impetus for social reform, would go hand in hand, which is democratizing and creating a more egalitarian society. But since the onset of such acceleration, the tempo of historical time has been constantly changing, and today, thanks to a population explosion, development of technological powers, and constant frequent changes of regime, acceleration belongs to everyday experience. A uniform, natural horizon of history has since been left far behind. The accelerative experience drew forth new perspectives imbued with the concept of revolution. Just to further build upon this point, if you look at, I hate to bring this up, but if you look at things like the World Economic Forum, much of their whole sort of self-identification and justification is that they present themselves as representing almost a historical inevitability. And it's the idea that technological change will bring about social change. And because this technological change, again, is assumed to be inevitable, the social change with it is correspondingly inevitable. It's rather sort of archaic if you think about it in that way, because it goes back to these utopian theorists of the 19th century who were trying to identify technological and social and political change as one and the same, and ascribe a certain, again, political and historical determinism to this. It's not a surprise that many people sort of look to the World Economic Forum and they derive a lot of sort of pejorative ideological labels to it, but that's precisely why. It's because it is founded in this idea of historical acceleration, and that acceleration, progress, technology permeating into everyone's lives, this whole experience of living in a world which has basically become derailed because there is no shared experience anymore. There is no sense of hierarchy. There is no sense of tradition. All of our certainties have become unencumbered. And so it seems that the world can go everywhere. It therefore, relies on us to be led by a technocratic hierarchy in terms of leading us to this new utopia, because only their foresight and their control, that direction, their revolutionary acumen essentially can guarantee that we arrive at this uniform and natural horizon together. Indeed, so much of the focus on the previous chapter I read out was talking about the innovations of the railway, and I added to it the innovations of the cruise line. I briefly mentioned the innovation of the plane, but take this and talk about the idea of the internet. There has been perhaps no greater instance in technology and the revolution of time itself than the invention of the internet, because right now I am communicating to people all over the world. My audience, for reference, is mostly in America, and I'm resident in England. And so, and you are, receiving this without sort of a significant sort of backlog, a significant delay. And so the ability to communicate instantly and communicate ideas, of course, using social media especially, means that humans are susceptible to forms of transmission of information and the acceleration of time, which I believe is almost inhuman. It's too much for our cognitive abilities to be able to handle. We talk about technology essentially being able to unmoor people from the limitations of nature. We can refine older technologies to the point that we have incredibly, good roads with, speedy carriages and good sail ships. But once you supersede the horse and you have the locomotive, once you ultimately supersede in many ways the locomotive and the cruise liner with the plane, and then you have transmissions that can go all across the world instantly, and everyone has access to it. It just reinforces this idea that as once the locomotive was seen as the agent of social change, leveling, democratization, so social media has that same effect. And of course, even you can say the existence of this channel, which is not being delivered through the traditional university system, again, is attesting to this. I am a complete byproduct of this new iteration of modernity in terms of the way I'm presenting to you on this channel right now. What I hope I can present in my various conversations across the years on this channel is that I'm not completely lacking self-awareness. Continuing on, the revolution was transformed to everyone into a historio-philosophical concept. That's a rather convoluted way, again, to say a historically sort of a historical concept which is grounded in philosophy. Like I was basically saying, you can look at Bergson, and if I were going to make it more convoluted, I would say Bergson is iterating a historico-philosophical concept based on a perspective of which displayed a constant and steady direction. There might be arguments over earlier versus later, or retardation versus acceleration, but the actual direction appeared to have been established once and for all. The revolution limps, scoffed Rivarol. Right moves continually to the left, but the left never to the right. This whole idea again of the revolution and the idea of progress. Cthulhu only swims leftward. That essentially is the paradox of the modern era. Modernity affords it this whole paradigm where the left, which represents the acceleration of time, versus again the perception of the right, which represents, if not the retardation of time, that would be the reactionary, then at least the stalling of time. Because accelerationism is perceived again to have this value which almost transcends individual actors and human experience, because history has been imbued with this agency, which is acceleration, which is modernity. Therefore, it only seems inevitable that the left will always win. This opens a space within which, since all political events could become estranged in terms of historical philosophy, but behind such expressions, which moved from the spatial to the temporal, an undeniable experience registers itself. Historical perspectives share with prognoses an implicit and irreversible trend covering all tendencies simultaneously. The repeated contamination of evolution since the 19th century does not indicate linguistic carelessness or political accommodation. The extensive interchangeability of both concepts indicates a structural dislocation in the entire social structure, which provoke answers differentiated only on a political plane. Evolution and revolution become as antitheses, partisan concepts. Their similar usage denotes the general expression of a movement for social emancipation driven by industrialization. Going back to Bergson and the whole idea again of the formidable sort of impressing of a notion, which again would seem to completely shift our understanding of a paradigm from that of change to that of a new thing, which is now concretely manifested, until we get a new thing again, which seems to be permanent in the fact that it's so irresistible. Evolution would almost imply by that sense, tinkering, refining an old concept. Better to constantly have new concepts all the time. So continuing on, the social revolution must write off the past and create its substance out of the future. Socialism is the revolution's declaration of permanence. Within the declaration of the revolution's permanence lies a deliberate and conscious anticipation of the future, as well as the implicit premise that the revolution will never be fulfilled. And that is the tragedy of the revolutionary. I mean, I've described elsewhere, described in a conversation which may come out in the next few weeks, that I look at the French Revolution as a traumatic event for both the left and the quote-unquote right. Those who chastise the French Revolution for causing a breach in the past, where you have this vanishing point represented by the hourglass, and the trauma for the left in the sense that the utopia didn't arrive and still hasn't arrived, but there was this anticipation which was created by the French Revolution for this utopia. You can say logically and politically the utopia can never arrive because it would justify a real revolution in the sense of the removal of the revolutionary vanguard or the political elites. And so, by definition, utopia cannot be fulfilled because what does utopia represent? It is, as a joke by St. Thomas More, utopia is no place. And it's far better, again, to bring people along with promises of earthly salvation, completely desacralized and removed from any notion of heavenly salvation, in order to ensure this declaration of permanent revolution, which, of course, is sort of a core tenet we see with Marxist-Leninist establishments that we see through the 20th century. But the whole notion of permanent revolution, revolution everywhere all at once, creates one of the great dichotomies in the Soviet Union between the Trotskyists, who adopt the idea of permanent revolution, and you can say the moment of Marxist accommodation with reality, which is socialism in one country. Here, Marx went beyond Kant, who in 1798 concluded from the failure of the first attempt that victory approached for revolution or reform, the lessons of recurring experience would at some time or other, with certainty, produce their lasting effect. Marx, who had diagnosed the process of upheaval as social and industrial revolution, found a most concise formula to characterize its individuality and futurity. However, this revolution became for him a personalized agent of history, disengaged from reality, in such a manner that communism as a domain of freedom remains unrealizable. What he's basically saying in that situation is that this goes into my argument, which I said isn't really applicable so much to this stream, which is the deification of the historical process, which for Marxists involves the quote-unquote scientific mantras of successive systems of material and political development. That, again, is why it was so important for me to announce at the beginning of the stream that there is a clear scientific definition of time, which is wedded to the notion of Chronos, which is our indication and measurement of time. But once you begin to move beyond that, then you enter the realms of subjective fantasy. That is historical truth. That's the paradox we live in. Subjective fantasy, unfortunately, in some cases, and perhaps fortunately in other cases, becomes a historical truth. It is a point of truth in which there was a transient point at which people believe these things to be true or have some significance, and then historians have then taken these arguments and believe them to have some relevance or some sort of greater point which is indicative to other things or comparisons or whatever. Historical truth is incredibly fluid, but it's ultimately intersubjective. So once you have this idea of the depersonalized agent of history through this system of, again, deterministic economic success and political sort of systems coming in succession, then you essentially arrive at the point where you've fundamentally perverted science. And you do so because you're capitalizing on the idea that there exists a war between science and religion. Religion, as it did during the French Revolution, represents superstition and it represents retardation. It is against the process of acceleration in history, which is true, undeniably. So, for Marx, championing the cause of scientism is also, as we see with other figures such as Auguste Comte and the positivists who believe that everything could be proved a posteriori without reference to intuition or relating back to concepts of God, then everything can essentially be made reducible to scientific axioms. Behind this paradox of a utopia that sees itself compelled to constant reproduction, there is hidden for us a further phenomenon which can be treated as the seventh feature. Hitherto, revolution has been presented as a meta-historical category that served to define social and industrial occurrences in terms of a self-accelerating process. And when we're talking about self-accelerating process, it is the perception of self-acceleration that it seems so, again, inexorable that the forces become almost inhuman. It's sort of in many ways the way that people deal with the economy. The economy becomes so vast that, and this is something that the Austrian School of Economics gets right, that economic activity can be predicted. And it sort of leads to my assumption, as with a lot of people, that a lot of modern economists are basically nothing better than shaman or soothsayers who are basically hired by governments to detect the entrails and to read the signs. You can write all of this off and say, well, one is just pagan superstition or whatever. But in terms of being able to reduce almost an impossibly complex system, which invariably involves all human agency interrelated, which is the global economy, the idea that, again, it can be reduced to simple categories and suggestions, as far as I'm concerned, is basically tantamount to a form of witchcraft. But here we are. Hitherto, revolution has been presented as a just reading this again, meta-historical category that served to define social and industrial occurrences in terms of a self-accelerating process. It is precisely this formulation that becomes the conscious claim to leadership for those who believe themselves to be initiated into the progressive laws of the revolution. This is a concept denoting a duty of activism, a meaning earlier inconceivable, but which directly heralds the professional revolutionary as figured in the mold, of course, of the 19th century and typified by Lenin. It begins with Lenin and it ends with Lenin, of course. But it also establishes a far more interesting point. It's not just that the whole idea of accelerationism and progression in history, the arrival of modernity, engenders these sort of actors who are there to harness these forces and bring people along to this new great horizon of a never utopia. But the idea that everyone has to be an active participant in the progress, it is one's duty to be an activist. During the French Revolution, Lazarcano, the author of Victory, so called, was able to mobilize hundreds of thousands of people from a basically unenthusiastic population in the defense of patrie, the defense of the fatherland. And it was under the mantra of every citizen as a soldier. If you're going to look at this within revolutionary language, aux armes citoyens, to armed citizens, then it necessarily sort of follows that a citizen has, you can say, a proactive duty to defend the existence of a republic, or else he is not a citizen. In the same way, in order to become part of the revolution, you must actively, progressively contribute to the revolution, to the situation of utopia, or else you are indicative of this regressive element, the counter-revolutionary, the internal saboteur, the lingering element of the persistence of these, retrograde historical elements like the kulak, the peasant. All of these people, again, are frustrating the progress towards utopia. And so everyone needs to be brought in. All the differentiations, the special categories, the old sort of historical relations, all of them need to be eliminated. Things that were, say, for example, brought around organically, in quotes, like the social effects of the invention of the railway. And even, you can say, cheap plane travel. We then have the historical political element, which is forced collectivization. All of this follows a similar pattern. So having discussed chronological time, Chronos, and having discussed Kairos, what I hope I've done is that I've demonstrated how Kairos's agency has metamorphosed over time itself, as taken as a historical record. This is not just an identification and trying to understand these concepts, but understanding these concepts existing within historical time itself. And so much of that, again, pertains to people's perception of time, a self-realization of time. And this comes back to my final category, which is Zeitbewusstsein, or else I basically refer to it as Bergson's durée. And I'm probably going to simplify it even more and just come back to the German word of Zeit. When you talk about, in English, the time, the times, it has a very specific connotation, the time in which we find ourselves. And that is why, again, this conversation sort of ends with the neue Zeit, the new time, meaning modernity. I believe it was Freulegrath who coined the term of modern history in the 1870s. But the interesting thing about this is that modern history was then retroactively assigned to a broad spectrum of period that occurred before the 1870s. You can say again, retroactively, we look at this tendency towards accelerationism in history. We look to this idea of progression, and we have to find the various antecedents. The great antecedent almost everyone points to is Petrarch and his reimagining of revitalization of the study of Cicero, and him identifying periods such as the Dark Ages, such as the pornocracy in papal history, but also identifying himself as living in a middle time, whatever that meant. To the point again, he is seen as the end of the medieval ages and sometimes as the herald of the Rinascimento, or the Renaissance, the New Age. You can look to earlier examples such as Herder again in the beginning of the 19th century, presaging much of Hegel, who would also think in terms of these middle times. But all this is to say is that there are elements seeping through as early as the beginning of the 14th century, that whatever time is, time without this notion of acceleration, without this notion of the expectation of a future, is arriving. And this goes back again to religion, to Christianity, to religious displacement, because the modern era, the modern history is almost always associated with the rise of Protestantism, that being 1517 and Lutherans' Christian Revolution. Because unlike what we have with St. Augustine of Hippo, whereby there is a tragic element of the dislocation of the earthly city and the heavenly city, and it doesn't rely essentially on these eschatological expectations of a literal second coming of Christ, which it becomes so in Protestantism. As it does become just that, the expectation that Christ is going to literally come down and he is going to bring about his new kingdom and the new millennium, it therefore invites a huge, significant level of religious expectation of the end times. The 16th century is a century of the expectation of the end times. We look to the diet, say, for example, of Speyer, and later to the times of the Rosicrucians, the end of the Holy Roman Empire, the beginning of the Great Reformation, the end of the Whore of Babylon in Rome. All of this is supposed to, again, indicate the end times. You take that, you combine it with the more cyclical construction of history, which had been inherited by figures such as Polybius, the cycle of civilizations, where you have the early, the middle, and the late. But instead of the early, the middle, and the late, now you have the early, the middle, the early modern, and now the modern. The modern is the new category which is inserted, which basically subverts this whole notion of a cyclical view of history. No longer are we looking at the civilization, this sort of succession of civilizational stages. Now we're looking at the arrival of a new period of time itself, the Neuzeit, the new modernity. Perhaps again, it's interesting to sort of think about German as a sort of useful sort of means of expressing these terms, because German, of course, uses compound nouns, which means you get terms like Neuzeit, Zeitgefühl, Zeitbewusstsein, which can't really exist in English. Even within history, of course, duration exists within English, but it doesn't have the same conceptual cachet that it does with durée in French, and of course within Greece. Within ancient Greek, of course, you have the terms of Chronos and Kairos, and how when you read the Greek Bible, these terms are used again with purposefulness in terms of the differentiation. But what I hope I've done in the stream is try and again chart a way of trying to use these very adaptable, very malleable concepts about the passive indicator of time, a more active agent of historical progress, and the realization, the awareness of a historical epoch, and how this can all actually arrive at a state where we have modernity. In fact, looking at just the research I've done for this stream, it's actually helped me quite significantly in terms of how I would identify the concept of modernity, because I'm one who's very, very picky when it comes to historical periodization. And funny enough, this wasn't a stream dealing with periodization so much as it was arriving at the historical time, which is the modern era, and trying to say that there's something more significant about that as far as our perceptions of time compared to all previous eras that have preceded it. That really, you can say, is part of the overall purpose for this stream, to the point that periodization, as far as I'm concerned, is far more granular, is far more nuanced. I mean, I did a whole stream dedicated to the periodization of Byzantine history. If you localize it again, you can become very, very nuanced and particular in terms of how certain things develop, or what is supposed to indicate this, or the transition into that, or whatever. As people know on the stream, Byzantium seems to be a thing which always sort of pops up here and there. But this is, again, something fundamentally different, something which, thanks to globalization, will come to inhabit the entire world. Indeed, it wasn't mentioned so much in the reading here. And indeed, it's not really a point mentioned that much anymore, but it was mentioned significantly during the Cold War, which is developed and undeveloped, or less developed. LDCs, less developed countries, the non-aligned pack, the Third World. All of this, again, was to indicate that by the 20th century, modernity was the expectation. You were either in a state of modernity, you were either in a slightly lesser state of modernity, or you had not reached a state of modernity. It's not just that modernity arrives in Europe, but there's this expectation that modernity has to arrive everywhere. And of course, what's the effect of modernity arriving everywhere? If modernity arrived in Germany and modernity was responsible for German unification, then invariably, if modernity arrives everywhere across the world, we reduce Europe to the size of Germany, while we reduce the world to the size of Europe. All of a sudden, again, you have the world city. You have that agent of political and social upheaval. If all of the history of the world is a history of change, is the history of the city, the world city becomes, the world government. And of course, that is why you need the permanent revolutionaries, the augurs of progress, in order to bring you to that sort of horizon. And the remarkable thing is how passive this all is. You can, read a lot of ideology, and it has been read, a significant amount of ideology and utopianism into this, but our whole conceptions of modern, less developed, and then also taking that further and saying that in the situation we have today, civilizations don't really have any qualitative difference between them. There is, no relative difference between countries. Citizens and people can basically be perceived as being interchangeable. All of this, again, is built with the expectation that historical progress and technological change will ultimately engineer a situation, almost by magic, it should be mentioned, whereby we all arrive at the state of, you can say, total democracy, which was the feeling inculcated in the 19th century that conceives of this whole notion, both historical and in terms of our own popular understanding, people's own understanding of where they themselves exist, of modern history, where everything is superseded, where you have the generational schisms which now exist today between the boomers, the Gen Xers, and the millennials, and will no doubt continue until there is the revolt against modernity, and of course Julius Evola wins in the end. All right. I haven't received any super chats this evening, so all I'm going to say is thank you everyone for listening, and I will see you on Saturday, hopefully, to talk about the Avignon papacy and the time where there were not one, not two, but three popes in Western Europe. Good night, everyone.